Yeah, exactly. In ours, we found that people were saying they go to hair salons a lot for their sense of community and as a place to kind of release and get mental health support. And so now that changes the scope a bit if you're thinking about where to connect with people and how to make sure they're taken care of. So yeah, it
Mhm,
is great when you get those responses. It may not be my research,
mhm.
but it doesn't matter because if the needs are being met in a way that I hadn't thought about before, then that should be informing my research. It should be informing my project and the content that I'm doing.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And there are folks out there, a colleague of mine who studies sort of sexuality in women in other countries that are not the US, has talked about going into these really conservative Muslim countries and going to hair salons to hear that information, ironically, because that is a space where people feel like they can share those things. And so, what a great example of like meeting people where they are and tailoring the work that we're doing to really engaging with what are the tools and resiliency that a community has. And I think that's an important point is that we often think about things in terms of deficits, but people are coming to us with strengths. And so we have to be able to sort of acknowledge and balance both of those, I think. Oh, I'm getting on a soapbox. Y'all better start asking me some questions or we're going to be here a while. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
So I'll ask a question. So in your talk, you talked about creating these empowerment spaces. Can you just describe like what does that look like from your perspective?
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question because I always want to talk about it, but if I go down that road, we won't have enough time. Yeah, so empowerment spaces are this kind of a term that I came up with to try and describe what I would hope would happen during a talk. So, empowerment spaces to me are spaces where we can acknowledge our stories, acknowledge our differences, have discourse about being different, and acknowledging sort of systemic pressures like racism, heterosexism, and having these conversations while also acknowledging that healing can happen and that you have value. And so, it's about having this sort of duality of there's this really hard experience that is rooted in systemic inequity, and there's resiliency and healing. And so, empowerment spaces aim to acknowledge these things, start to process these things through community coming together. And then hopefully people leave that empowerment space feeling empowered to do work, to really acknowledge their story in every part of your life. Because it's not just acknowledging our positionality as researchers, there's more to it than that. Our identities, our experiences guide every behavior we have, from whether we say hi to somebody or not. And so hopefully empowerment spaces really are about increasing awareness so that people can really make values and identities driven decisions in the work that they do and how they serve their community. Yeah. And I'm happy to
And
talk
just
about.
one follow-up question. Are there any like training resources available for how we create those, or can you point us in any directions?
Yeah, I mean, so spoiler alert, our organization right now is working through sort of how do we provide resources and toolkits to creating empowerment spaces. So that is something that is
Wow.
coming. But in lieu of that, for now, I am more than happy to have conversations with folks at any time about how do we create those spaces. Um, I think, it comes back to creating a space where you're okay with vulnerability because vulnerability can sometimes mean you have to be okay with the fact that we've wronged folks. And
Yeah.
so um, that can be really hard to sit with. The
Yeah.
fact that people don't feel safe going to therapy. Members of my own community, like my grandmother, when I told her I wanted to study mental health, was like, go be a real doctor. Like that is such a deep rooted sense of like,
Mhm.
they don't want us here. And so we have to be able to sit with that. Um, all of that to say that creating these empowerment spaces is difficult. But it
Mhm.
really is about listening, about owning your own power and privilege. Even me as a speaker, like I have the privilege of sort of controlling the narrative. And so being okay with like, no, this is what does the community need? You tell me what you need. Um, yeah. So long story short is there will be resources, but until then, I am happy to be sort of a thought partner at any time. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? I will throw out there that one of the most sort of surprising questions I've gotten is what Hogwarts house I'm in. And so I'll just share that I'm a Hufflepuff if you couldn't guess already. I don't know how many of you are into Harry Potter, but apparently that audience really was. And so that's cool.
Hey, yes, my name is Gilbert Parr, and I'm from the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And thank you so much for your kind of talk earlier. It's very, very inspiring. And as you were talking, one of the things that I was kind of wondering is, I think individuals who have experienced trauma often, that as you talked about, kind of that avoidance is kind of a key symptom or a key part. And I'm wondering if you could share any of the experiences of kind of being able to hear the voices of people who tend to kind of be avoidant and may not be able to kind of, for lots of different reasons, kind of have their voice heard in these needs assessment, and may not be getting the kind of services that could be helpful. So if you could kind of share your thoughts and experiences about that.
Yeah. As you're talking, the first thing that comes up for me is the struggle of sitting with ambivalence. As a therapist, but also as like a friend and brother, I think one of the most frustrating things is when somebody is suffering and yet doesn't necessarily feel pushed or moved towards any sort of behavioral change. That can be a really hard experience, and still is, no matter how long I think you do therapy. And so sometimes, well, there's so many thoughts. First of all, I think that when we're working with minoritized groups specifically, and that's sort of the lens that I focus on, people may not have the language or the sort of critical awareness of how systems and society impacts your experience of trauma, right? And so we're living in a time where things are considered isolated, and they're not. And so as someone, no matter if you're a therapist or if you're a person, just kind of acknowledging, oh, there are larger things at play that keep people quiet, that unintentionally or sometimes intentionally silence folks. And so it is not uncommon, and it is not surprising that folks don't feel safe to come forward when there are forces at play that often tell you not to. I think that the hardest part of getting someone to share that piece with you is to create a sense of safety. And that doesn't mean, and this is going to come across as shady, but hopefully it doesn't. But that doesn't mean the sort of performative piece of like, remember when everything happened last summer and people started posting black squares? Great. And there's a level of action that's required beyond that. We have to truly be considered safe in order for people to share with us. And that means knowing that like you have to acknowledge that you don't know everything. So even though I'm Latino, for example, I have no sense of structural racism at every level. There's no way that I can understand every single person of color's experience. That's just not possible. And so coming into it with gentility, curiosity, respect, actively listening, and then being able to hold that and say like, your experience is valid even if you don't have a name for it, I think is a really, really powerful piece to that. I feel like there was more to your question, and so if you have some follow-up questions, I'm happy to answer them because I don't think I'm getting all of it. I want to make sure.
No, I really appreciate that. And something you said in your talk earlier, you talked about kind of structural needs. And that's not the language you use. You use something better, but I really appreciate that, because I think a lot of times, we tend to kind of think about individuals and kind of helping individuals. But I think there are at least I'm starting to understand a lot more about kind of the structural pieces to these needs. And I really like the language that you used around that. But thank you. I think you answered my question.
Absolutely. A couple of weeks ago, I was doing a talk and somebody said to me, I'm going to start asking people, how do you think heterosexism impacts the ways in which people view your your romantic relationships? And I took a step back and said, do you think that everyone's going to know what heterosexism is? And so being able to just say things like, how do you think, and actually naming, how do you think how do you think the fact that society may not approve of the way that you love impacts your romantic relationships? And so being very concrete and actually being very direct is super important. We dance around it with all this jargon, and sometimes that's a way of really, unfortunately, just kind of falling into the system. Sometimes gentle disruption is okay. And maybe not so gentle, but different ideas.
Patty shared in the chat, Walter Flores talks about this as giving voice teeth. That was an inspiring thing she read recently. Patty, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that or share anything.
Sorry, I have my camera off because I'm trying to sneak in some
You're
lunch.
totally fine.
It's noon here. But no, I just, Jose, I just would loved your presentation earlier and just some kind of soaking in every little tidbits of things you're sharing, because, creating empowerment space is such a hard thing to do. And the work we're doing with SciFire is all about leadership and civic engagement development for 2 generations. And so thinking a lot about empowerment space and thinking how we instill the skills of assessing systems and understanding how you can be engaged in systems to change them has been something we didn't realize would really mean something when we went into 2020. And so super appreciate all that you've done. And I just shared the Walter Flores idea about giving voice teeth, because it's something that I'm starting to talk with county and city staff and electeds about, because a lot of people want our families to come and talk to them about racism and talk to them about what they need in the city to change, but then there's no follow through on action. And so really, the question I ask a lot of people is, how are you going to give what you learn teeth to really impact how you move your next steps forward?
And that is so powerful, right? Especially if you're living in a system that has constantly let you down.
Yeah.
Like we don't want to be the next person to let you down.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you're just speaking the gospel for me. So keep going. Big fan.
No, I really, really appreciate that. That's really sweet. Any other thoughts? I'm really enjoying sort of thinking through a lot of this.
Jose, this is Ellie. I'm from the University of Minnesota. I think in your intro, they said that you were an author or a writer. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes.
Can you tell us what you have authored?
Yes. So ironically, it is not academic writing. Maybe that'll be maybe that'll be a goal someday. But what it's been is just poetry. I was able to collaborate on a book. It's called Stars, and they brought a bunch of writers from all over the country who care about mental health, and anonymously just said, hey, write about finding light in the dark. And we didn't know each other. We didn't know who the writers were. And at the end of it, the publisher sent us the copy with all of our names and our bios. And it was really just this collaboration of like resistance, resiliency. And so it's something I never thought I would do. I never thought I would share my writing with the world. And it's a passion of mine. And so I was encouraged to include author in my bio. And yeah, it was
awesome.
one of the most vulnerable experiences of my life, I think.
Great. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Thank you for asking. I, not purposely, but I often don't think about it. So I'm glad that you asked.
I wanted to know because you are such an amazing, reflective storyteller. And I could just listen and listen to you. So I was hoping there was something non-academic that I could grab on.
Yes, there it is. And actually, I guess I'll give you guys an inside scoop. So in about approximately 2 weeks, but towards the end of this month, I'm releasing a podcast that'll be streaming internationally, all about evolving the mental health conversation. So
Wow.
you'll be able to find it relatively soon. If you want to hear more about it, you can follow the Phoenix Empowered on social media platforms, and it'll be coming out very, very soon with some pretty amazing guests.
Awesome.
So thank you for reminding me to bring that up, because
Awesome. Exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, I can't just do academic writing. I love it, but I need the balance. I need that
Yep.
creativity and passion.
For sure.
Mhm. Oh, thank you. Ah, you found it. Yes, you did.
I had to flex my Google foo, but I did find it.
Yeah, yeah. I'm impressed. That was pretty quick. Any other questions? Feel free to ask pretty much anything.
This is Gilbert again. I'm sorry I'm not in a space where there's kind of people will be running around in the background, so that's why I turned my camera off. But and one of the things I really appreciate about what you shared is kind of this idea of vulnerability. And I think in kind of big spaces where vulnerability can be really hard, I was just wondering if you could talk in your experiences about how to kind of balance that kind of space of kind of helping people to be kind of vulnerable, but also kind of
Oh, Gilbert, I think you cut out a little bit at the end. I'm happy to start answering the question, but I don't want you to miss it. So I'm like, do I start?
I can propose another question or just a thought that I was having. And I think Adia spoke to this as well, thinking about as a researcher, I often think about that I know the things that folks needs or that folks need or that I have good answers and ways to support folks. And thinking about coming to a community and being so excited about a project or an idea that I have for resources or things we can offer, and making sure that you're vulnerable and open to thinking you don't have the answers or the answers you have are good ones, but not necessary or needed at this time or are already met by this other need. And I was really thinking about what you said, Adia, about like listening to what's already there and encompassing that into your knowledge of the space and making that kind of drive you forward to learn more about that piece. So not walking away thinking like, well, I have the answer, it's too bad they don't want it. But acknowledging like there's more than one answer and there's much more I have to learn. I've spent all this time becoming an expert in this thing or developing this curriculum or this program. But there are ways that I can change and improve it. And that's something that I should come into the space being vulnerable enough to accept and to hear.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, can I just piggyback off of that? Because I think that also kind of speaks to what I was thinking about some of the other comments and Jose, some of what you were saying in this session is about the relationship. And that sometimes, especially when we're on a time crunch, it's hard to imagine like being able to develop a relationship that might be needed to have that level of vulnerability. So even kind of thinking through what are some ways that might help to bring out some of the vulnerability a little bit more to have that relationship so that you can kind of figure out on the front end, hey, is this really, I can be really honest and they can be honest and forthcoming and we can really see if we're compatible and have that partnership instead of coming in, not being vulnerable and stifling the ability to bridge that gap and to create a relationship. So it's kind of a dance, but I like that we're talking about vulnerability and Jose, I like that you're emphasizing that because I don't think we talk about that enough. And that's what really we need people to do by we ourselves as researchers or project directors, as well as the communities that we'd like to partner with. Like we need to model that and really think about I'm trying to form a relationship because this project will only work if I have that. And for sci-fi projects, they're only 5 years. And so I can appreciate the stress and the sense of urgency to try to just move it along. But yeah, it might also be helpful to have a space where you think through, like, how do you make connections? How do you build trust? And how are you able to do that in whatever confines or restrictions that you might have?
Absolutely. And I think that relates to how I was hoping to answer Gilbert's question, and I'm happy to repeat it when he joins us again. But I think that it's on the sort of in the court of the researcher or project director to model that vulnerability. If we want folks to be vulnerable with us, then we have to be willing to kind of push that needle on what it means to be vulnerable. Now, I am of the camp, and others may disagree, that all of the work that we do, all of the research or projects that we manage, are guided by something. Something in our experiences, something in our values guides what we do. I have a hard time believing that somebody can be so distant from the work that they do. It's just, I don't know how you do that day in and day out. And so I think being authentic and honest about what is guiding this passion of yours. There's a saying, research is me search. I study BIPOC LGBTQ plus folks. Why? Because that's my experience. Those are the communities that I resonate with, among others. But like that leads me. And so being very upfront about that, I think, is important. And I think part of how we model that vulnerability outside of sharing our intentions and sharing sort of our process is also sharing, like, we hope that we accomplish X, Y, and Z. How would this look like for you? And so creating a space where we want to hear people's thoughts slowly will allow people to feel like they can actually share things, because we're creating a space where we're asking questions. Yeah, I think that's the start. I think vulnerability takes time to foster, and I think we have to be okay with the fact that it's going to take work. Reconciliation and sort of reparations, that takes work. That takes work. I hope that was a semi-okay answer. But vulnerability in and of itself, I don't even know that I fully feel like I understand what that even looks like for everyone, because it'll look different for each person.
Jose, my name is Brian Lucky. I'm from Nevada right now, and sorry I don't turn on my camera. The internet here has been weird all day, been zapping in and out. So I apologize if I zap out while I'm asking this question. I'm sort of, I'm I guess, Gen Xer, and so things in my generation moved pretty slowly, and especially with this idea of not only gender identity but orientation and the LGBTQ plus alphabet soup that's out there. I heard a comment earlier in this conference about that the younger generation, specifically even those elementary, junior high age kids right now, are really taking a step back, and they're trying to redefine what it even means to be gender identity, or it's almost like everything is fluid to them, or everything is, there are no labels. I have two young sons who are trying to identify what they are. Are they gay? Are they transgender? Are they non-binary? When working with youth, how do we navigate that space where they're not comfortable with labels, period? At the same time, they're not sure where they belong. I mean, this whole idea of pronouns to them is just, what pronouns? Can there just be a person? I'm my name. How do you work with people through that piece? My generation has this idea that, being gay, homosexual is not a choice. And yet, I think the kids may have a different idea of that. They choose to be a part of this community because the LGBTQ plus community is so accepting and so open and so a place for them to belong. And my rhetoric of it's not a choice seems a little antiquated when I talk to them about that. So how do you help them navigate that space in a healthy way?
Yeah. So a couple of things, and I'm glad you brought up sort of the younger generation, because that was another thought that I had as we were talking about vulnerability, is that like I get really excited about the fact that the younger generation is pushing us to really think creatively about how we offer supports, how we engage in community. I mean, we joke about TikTok, or at least people in my life joke about TikTok, and yet like we're seeing people talking about going to therapy. We're seeing people talking about, hey, when I have anxiety, here's how I cope. People are really, really pushing the boundary on what it means to provide services, what it means to support communities. So that to me is super exciting, and it means that when we go into communities and ask what is needed, there might be an answer. We need to be more creative. We need to be more innovative. I think mental health should be innovative and bold. Frankly, engaging with humans should be innovative and bold, which I think sort of aligns with your question. And I think identity development is so individualized. It is someone's journey of finding themselves. And my sort of thought process with the idea of labeling has been, how does labeling function? Who does it serve? Does it serve the individual to assume a label? Or is it that this experience is just so fluid, unclear, sort of maybe even uncomfortable, and they're still sort of figuring it out? And so I think we're living in a society that wants to impose a label because it means we can categorize things. And I think that we're actually moving away from that, and accepting that things are on a spectrum and things are fluid allows us to just allow the person to have that individual experience and connect with whichever communities feel most aligned with their values. I think the challenge to that then becomes, we don't know where to put people. But I think the answer is that there is nowhere to put people. Part of why I don't like the word marginalization, for example, is that it assumes that people live on the margins, when in fact we don't. We're in every facet of society, but we're placed on the margins. That's a very, very different narrative. And so thinking about, to your question about how do we support younger folks who are going through identity development, I think is encouraging fluidity, encouraging that sort of exploration, and knowing that at some point in your life, you'll start to figure out what is authentic to you and what isn't, and that takes time. And so frankly, I think, unfortunately, it means sitting with the discomfort of like, I don't know how to help you, or I don't know what your pronouns are, or what your preferred name is. And I'm still on this journey with you because I'm supporting you. And that speaks to being the best ally that you can be, right? Is being on that journey with folks. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but that's sort of my reaction to it.
No, I think it's excellent. I have an experience with a young person who changes their pronouns, I don't know, monthly probably. And it's this journey with everybody else around this person going, okay, is it she this week? Is it he this week? Is it they this week? And I think slowly I see this person becoming he, moving forward slowly. It might be a fluid situation, but it's really to your talk about, the spectrum, or not the spectrum. That's another word for another time, but
Sure.
this idea of a continuum, I think is excellent. It's just, it can be tough to watch and difficult to support. So I think,
Which is
thank
why
you for
open
your
communication is so important. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And saying things like, hey, I might mess up because I'm trying to be supportive, but don't really know how. That's totally okay to own that and say, like, it's really hard to know sort of which pronouns to use. And I'm still going to do my best to authentically identify you. Big part of allyship is sitting with that oscillating, right? Because oftentimes, frankly, people oscillate quite a bit. Like, I don't think I know many people who are like, this is who I am and this is who I will always be. That journey is just so complex. And imagine like kids going through this on their own. I can't imagine. Been there, but also like don't want anyone else to be there.
Yeah, I told my son, I'm so glad none of this existed when I was a kid, because I would have just been spinning in circles the whole time. I have no idea how they do it.
I think it's a great opportunity for growth. For our kids are going to teach the older generation growth, acceptance, understanding. And I think that's with my girl, it's always, I love you. Good morning. How's it going today? They'll tell you. It'll get there. But it's a great opportunity for self-growth and helping them grow. Because I like what our speaker Jose said is you're not stuck in one place. You continue to grow in life. Sorry.
Yeah. No, don't be sorry. Don't be sorry. Yeah, I think, each generation contributes something new to our understanding and our experiences. I think our generations have really contributed to this sense of like starting to figure out activism and resiliency and strength. And now this new generation is like, okay, so what do we do with this? If we're going to encourage resiliency and activism, what does that mean for how we shift in society? So that's what I think we're seeing is we're seeing a shift in our conceptualization of identity, which can be stressful, absolutely. And it's like really encouraging that people can live their full truths. I get really excited about this stuff if you haven't already noticed.
And this is Ellie. I have a youth in my life from church that is queer, and he will come out and say, today my pronouns are, because it is so fluid. And I really appreciate that about him. And it's really helped me in thinking about all this, understand the fluidity of all of it. Because, he's 17 years old and things are extremely fluid for him right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was thinking about, so at University of Minnesota, we had a training video that everybody was completing. Adia knows the one I mean. It took a couple of hours, but part of it came from an office and folks had included their pronouns. And there was one individual who did not use pronouns. Instead, they used their first name. And I thought about that and kind of how I hadn't really considered the ways in which, like, even just needing to let folks know what your pronouns are forces you to make some choices, that there are a couple of discrete and bound categories that we've all agreed on for the moment. And kind of what a relief it might be to just be like, none of those apply to me and I just don't want to use them. And I don't want to talk to you about, what it is this week or what it feels like. For me, I'm going to simplify things for myself or, I don't know what that person's experience was like, but I don't know. It was a moment for me that I just hadn't considered and helped me grow, even just seeing that person on camera and that experience.
Absolutely. And that seems to really align with, both Ellie and Brian talking about the person-centered approach, right? So centering that the person's experience is so complex that no one identity is going to conceptualize who they are, or who any of us are. We're a bunch of pieces coming together. It's that classic puzzle piece. Each identity is a piece of that puzzle. And so being open to sort of seeing the person as a whole rather than as one piece of the sort of identity spectrums. And I also just want to say, just for the record, and also as a human, like, keep being fluid and keep being open to that, because you have no idea how empowering and accepting it feels for people to value and identify you as you want to be identified. It can be a really healing experience in a community where there's been a lot of pain and frankly a lot of violence. Just speaking authentically and truthfully, it can be very dangerous and scary to be who you are. And so those moments where people are like, hey, what are your pronouns? That's a pretty powerful and hopefully healing moment.
And we have just 2 or 3 more minutes. If anybody has final questions for Jose.
Can I share a quick story, if you guys don't mind?
Storytelling is the way to vulnerability. Go for it.
Right? Well, for my kid, he's just turned 8 in April. So the world is really starting to show itself to him. He's grasping things. And I live in middle of Montana. So our nearest accepting city, I'll use that word, is 4 hours away. And we happened to be there. I had to go over there for work. And so my baby wanted a late snack, and we Googled food open, and there was a pizza place down the road, but it was a typical pizza place. So when the sun goes down, you get all walks of life, and marijuana is legal here, right? Now backtrack a little bit. My kid watches YouTube. I don't know who does it. And they explained what a Karen was to him in YouTube. He's like, Mom, we're not Karens. And I was like, I'd like to, I don't think so. I'd like to think we're okay. So we're walking downtown to this pizza place, and you can smell weed all over it. He's like, what's that smell? What is that? And I tell him, he said, isn't that a drug? And I said, that's not your choice. That's not your decision for them. And his mind's just going, and I know. So we sit down at this pizza place, and all walks of life are coming. And this gentleman in pumps, bedazzled, you can't tell until you see the feet, and he starts speaking that he's he, he's gay, whatever. And so he starts talking right by my boy. My boy turns around, and he kind of like starts looking at him, and I see his wheels turning. He gets to the high heels, the pumps, and he looks at me, his eyes get big, and I said, don't be a Karen. And his face was dropped, and it's like, I was like, that's his choice. That's her choice, and it's up to them to live their life, and there's nowhere, it's not up to you. But Mom, I was like, it is what it is, my boy. You're going to meet people like this in life. It's okay. And okay. And he cracked me up because he's like, those shoes look like they hurt though. And I started laughing. I was like, yeah, I bet they do. But it was a real strong moment for him. Like, yeah. I got to show him other people. Montana, where I'm from, there's not a lot of different folks walking around. So when he got to see all these, it was really cool. It was enlightening. I got to show him, and I hope, and I'll go in a little bit more detail soon, that we can't put our judgments forward, right. Like, accept him. He wants to wear pumps, and he's gonna wear pumps. Yeah.
Absolutely. Teaching acceptance so young is super important. And not only acceptance, right, but celebrating yeah. People come from different walks of life, and we get to experience that sort of diversity, which helps us grow each and every time. Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, I love that. Also, Montana is beautiful. One of my favorite.
Very green.
Yes.
Yeah, right now.
But y'all like the snow too much. I could never. The Caribbean. No.
Crazy thing, like, what was it, 2-3 weeks ago, we got snow, and then 4 days later it hit 80 degrees. But I love your talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes, Jose, we definitely want to thank you for joining us for the conference, and thank you for your time.